That heavy, blocked feeling when stool just won't pass, no matter how hard you try. It's more common than most people admit. And in most cases, it isn't caused by what you eat. It's caused by a habit you've probably repeated hundreds of times without ever thinking twice about it. Before getting into that habit, it helps to understand what's actually happening when stool becomes stuck. This condition is often called fecal impaction, and it's different from ordinary constipation. Ordinary constipation usually means bowel movements are infrequent or difficult, but the stool still eventually moves through and comes out. Impaction is more specific. It means a mass of hard, dry stool has become lodged, most often in the rectum, and the body struggles to pass it on its own. The rectum is the final short stretch of the digestive tract, right before the exit point. Its job is simple: hold stool temporarily until it's convenient to release it, then signal the brain when it's time to go. Under normal circumstances, that system works smoothly, but the longer stool sits in the rectum, the more water gets pulled back out of it by the surrounding tissue. That process is completely normal in small amounts. It's how the body prevents diarrhea. The problem starts when stool sits there far longer than it's supposed to, and continues drying out and hardening, until it's dense enough that it becomes physically difficult, or even impossible, to pass without help. So the real question is, what makes stool sit in the rectum long enough for that to happen? To answer that, you have to look at one everyday behavior most people don't think twice about. That behavior is ignoring the urge to go, not once in a while, chronically, repeatedly, as a pattern. This is the habit that stands out above the others. It's not the occasional missed glass of water. It's not one day of low fiber. It's not a single stressful week without exercise. Those things matter, but on their own, they rarely cause stool to become physically stuck. What creates that outcome, over and over in clinical observations, is the daily practice of feeling the urge to have a bowel movement and choosing to wait. It happens in ordinary moments. Someone feels the signal during a work meeting and decides it can wait until later. Someone feels it in a public restroom they'd rather avoid and holds off until they get home. Someone is absorbed in a task, or traveling, or simply uncomfortable with the timing and pushes the urge aside, assuming it will just come back later exactly the same way. That assumption is where the real trouble begins, because the urge doesn't just patiently wait in the background. Something changes internally every time it's ignored, and that change is the actual mechanism connecting this habit to stool becoming stuck. To see why this is so damaging, it helps to understand what's actually happening inside the rectum in the minutes after that signal first appears. The rectum contains stretch receptors, nerve endings that sense when stool has arrived and the walls have expanded even slightly. Those receptors are what generate the urge in the first place. They send a signal to the brain saying it's time to find a bathroom. But when that signal is ignored, the rectum doesn't simply pause and wait patiently for a more convenient time. Instead, the muscles at the exit gradually relax back into a holding position, and the urge itself starts to fade. This is sometimes described as accommodation. The rectum adjusts to the presence of stool already inside it, and the nerve signals that were firing insistently a few minutes earlier quiet down. From the outside, this feels like relief. The urgency passes, and it seems like the moment has simply gone away on its own. But the stool hasn't gone anywhere. It's still sitting in the rectum, and now it's sitting there for an extended period instead of a short one. During that extra time, the surrounding tissue keeps pulling water out of it, the way it's designed to do. The stool that was originally soft and easy to pass becomes firmer. If the urge is ignored again the next time it appears, and then again the time after that, this becomes a repeating pattern rather than a one-time event. Here's the part that makes this habit particularly damaging over the long run. The stretch receptors that create the urge don't stay perfectly sensitive forever. When they're repeatedly triggered and then ignored, they gradually require more volume, more stretching, before they fire again. In simpler terms, the rectum slowly becomes less responsive. It takes a larger and larger amount of stool sitting there before the brain even receives the message that it's time to go. Meanwhile, the stool that's accumulating during that stretched out timeline continues to harden further. This is the feedback loop connecting the habit to the outcome in the title. Ignore the signal. The rectum stretches and adapts. The urge becomes fainter. More stool builds and dries out. and the whole cycle repeats until a mass forms that's genuinely difficult for the body to expel without assistance. Before we go any further, there's something else feeding into this exact cycle that most people never even consider. Because everything happening inside the rectum gets worse when something invisible is already working against your gut every single day. Researchers looking into why one entire population barely deals with this problem, despite eating in ways that should make it worse, traced part of the answer back to a hidden airborne factor sitting in most American homes and a strange, overlooked underwater ingredient used for thousands of years to support smooth, comfortable digestion. If you want to see exactly what that hidden factor is and how that ingredient fits into all of this, point your phone camera at the QR code on the screen right now. There's also a link pinned in the comments below. This cycle rarely happens because of one dramatic event. It happens because of ordinary, repeated choices made across weeks, months, or even years, which is exactly why so many people don't connect their current discomfort to a habit that felt harmless at the time. Understanding why this habit is so widespread helps explain why it so often goes unnoticed until symptoms are already present. Work environments are one of the biggest contributors. Meetings, deadlines, and the simple discomfort of stepping away from a desk repeatedly train people to treat the urge as an interruption rather than a signal worth listening to. Public and shared restrooms create a similar effect. Many people feel uncomfortable using a restroom outside their own home, so they instinctively delay, sometimes for hours at a stretch, assuming their body will simply cooperate later. Travel disrupts the pattern even further. Unfamiliar bathrooms, long flights, car rides, and shifted schedules all encourage postponement, sometimes for an entire day. Distraction plays a role too. It's easy to be absorbed in a phone, a task, or a conversation, and only vaguely register the urge, treating it as something to deal with in a few more minutes rather than acting on it right away. This habit often starts young. Children frequently ignore the urge to go because they're in the middle of playing, uncomfortable using a school restroom, or simply not paying attention to their body's signals yet. When this becomes a repeated pattern in childhood, it can carry forward as a default response into adulthood, reinforced year after year without ever being consciously examined. Because none of this looks dramatic in the moment, most people don't notice anything is building until the warning signs are already fairly clear. Recognizing those signs early makes a meaningful difference, because the earlier this pattern is interrupted, the easier it typically is to reverse. One of the most common signs is a persistent feeling of incom, pleat emptying even right after a bowel movement. The sense that something is still there, but nothing more comes out no matter how much time or effort is spent, is one of the clearest early indicators that stool is beginning to sit longer than it should. Straining is another common sign. When stool has hardened due to prolonged retention, passing it comfortably becomes difficult, and many people find themselves needing to push harder or spend significantly more time in the bathroom than they used to. A sense of pressure or fullness in the lower abdomen or rectal area, even between bathroom visits, can also point to stool accumulating rather than moving through on a normal schedule. Some people notice their urges becoming less frequent overall, not because their body needs to go less, but because the receptors responsible for generating that signal have become less responsive from repeated postponement. Small, hard stools, sometimes resembling pellets, are another common indicator, since they reflect the extended drying out process described earlier. One sign that often causes confusion is occasional unexpected leakage, sometimes mistaken for diarrhea. This can actually happen when looser stool from higher up in the digestive tract seeps around a harder, impacted mass that's blocking the rectum. Because this looks like the opposite problem, it's frequently misread, and people sometimes assume their system is too loose rather than blocked. Any of these signs, especially when several appear together or persist for more than a few days, are worth paying attention to, and it's reasonable to check in with a healthcare provider rather than assuming they'll resolve on their own. Left unaddressed, this pattern doesn't stay the same size indefinitely. It tends to build gradually. What starts as mild, occasional discomfort can progress into a more established impaction, where the stool mass becomes large and firm enough that normal bowel movements alone aren't enough to clear it. At that point, Some people require additional intervention to help the body pass what's built up, rather than being able to resolve it through diet or minor lifestyle changes alone. This is part of why catching the pattern early, while it's still just a habit and not yet a physical blockage, makes such a meaningful difference. Certain situations make this cycle more likely to develop or to become more severe. People with limited mobility, older adults, and individuals who spend long periods sitting or lying down often have naturally slower movement through the digestive tract to begin with, which means any additional delay from habitually ignoring the urge has a more pronounced effect. Similarly, people managing chronic stress, irregular schedules, or conditions that already affect bowel sensation may find that repeated postponement compounds those existing challenges more quickly than it would for someone without those factors. None of this means the situation is out of anyone's control. Because the root cause described here is behavioral, the most effective response is also behavioral, and it starts with a fairly simple shift: responding to the urge when it appears, rather than treating it as something that can always wait. This doesn't require dramatic lifestyle changes. It means recognizing that the urge to go is a time-sensitive signal, not a flexible reminder, and giving it priority within a reasonable window, rather than pushing it aside repeatedly throughout the day. Building a consistent daily rhythm also helps retrain the system. Many people find it useful to set aside a similar time each day, often shortly after a meal, when the body's natural digestive activity is already elevated, to sit and allow enough time without rushing. This isn't about forcing anything, but about giving the body a predictable opportunity, so the urge is less likely to be overridden by a busy schedule. Alongside this behavioral shift, supporting factors make the process easier. Adequate fluid intake keeps stool softer, so if the urge is delayed even briefly, the consequences are less severe. Regular movement throughout the day helps stimulate normal digestive activity. Fiber from whole foods adds bulk that makes stool easier to pass, but it's worth noting that fiber alone rarely solves this issue if the underlying habit of ignoring the urge continues unchanged. The behavior itself has to shift for lasting improvement to follow. For those who've already been ignoring the urge for a long time, it's worth understanding that rebuilding sensitivity in the rectum doesn't happen instantly. The nerve receptors that gradually became less responsive from repeated postponement can often regain some of that responsiveness once the pattern changes, but this tends to happen gradually over weeks rather than overnight. Consistency matters more than intensity here. Responding to the urge every time it appears, even when it's inconvenient, sends a repeated signal to the body that the urge will be honored, which over time helps restore a more predictable rhythm. It also helps to pay attention to posture during a bowel movement, since this can make a meaningful difference in how completely the rectum empties. Elevating the knees slightly above hip level, using a small stool under the feet if needed, allows the muscles involved to relax more fully and can reduce the tendency to strain. This doesn't replace addressing the underlying habit, but it does support the process while that habit is being retrained. There are situations where these adjustments alone aren't enough, and that's an important distinction to make. If someone has already gone several days without a bowel movement, is experiencing significant abdominal pain, noticeable swelling, or ongoing leakage around a sensation of blockage, these are signs that stool may have already become impacted to a degree that requires evaluation from a healthcare provider. In some cases, additional steps are needed to help clear an existing blockage before the daily habit changes described earlier can even take effect, simply because the mass has already become too firm or too large to pass on its own. There's no reason to feel embarrassed bringing this up with a healthcare provider. It's an extremely common issue, and providers see it regularly, particularly in people who've spent years unconsciously repeating the same pattern of delay. For most people, though, the story doesn't reach that point, and understanding the mechanism early is exactly what prevents it from getting there. The pattern described throughout this video isn't rare or unusual. It's one of the most ordinary habits a person can have, which is exactly why it so often goes unexamined. Nobody sets out to strain their digestive system by sitting through one more meeting or waiting for a more convenient bathroom. But the body doesn't measure intention. It responds to repetition. And a habit repeated enough times, even one as small as waiting 15 more minutes, is capable of gradually reshaping how a basic bodily function operates. What makes this particular habit worth paying close attention to isn't that it's dramatic or dangerous in any single instance. It's that it's invisible in the moment and cumulative over time. Each delayed trip to the bathroom feels like nothing on its own. It's only when that choice is repeated day after day, year after year, that the rectum's sensitivity shifts, that stool sits longer than intended, and that the groundwork for impaction gets laid one ignored signal at a time. The encouraging part of this entire picture is that because the cause is behavioral, the solution doesn't require anything complicated or expensive. It requires attention, noticing the urge when it happens, treating it as something with a limited window rather than something flexible, making space for it during the day instead of assuming the body will simply hold everything perfectly until a more convenient hour arrives. That one shift, practiced consistently, addresses the root of the problem far more directly than any specific food, supplement, or remedy ever could on its own. Understanding how the body actually works here changes the way this whole issue looks. It's not a mysterious digestive problem that appears out of nowhere. It's the predictable result of a system responding exactly the way it's designed to respond, when the signal it depends on keeps getting overridden. Once that connection is clear, the path forward becomes a lot less complicated because it stops being about fixing a vague, confusing symptom and starts being about adjusting one specific, everyday behavior that's been quietly running in the background all along.